Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Human Sciences, the IWM, everyone here in the hall, and for those of you watching online, welcome for a rather special event, in my opinion. I'll explain why in a minute. For those of you here, after our intellectual endeavors this evening, we shall have a different type of an endeavor with wine and cheese. So prepare yourself for that. Why is this a special event? Well, it's a special event because Richard Parker is a very old friend of mine and taught me more or less everything I know about American politics, apart from a few books I've read, which he had recommended to me anyhow. So Richard is a professor of public policy emeritus at Harvard, but although he's emeritus, his lectures are deemed so popular year after year by students that they've asked him to come back and carry on teaching, despite the fact that he's theoretically retired. And he teaches public policy, politics, political economy. He has a distinguished career, first as a journalist and activist, as one of the co-founders of Mother Jones. He has also had a close association at times with The Nation magazine. He's published in all sorts of places in the United States. His D.Phil was published in English and German as The Myth of the Middle Class. He was the first person to identify that the declining inequality in the United States over several decades was actually about to turn and become increasing inequality in the United States, which is something he'll touch upon this evening. And he is also the author of the definitive biography of J.K. Galbraith. And indeed, it's thanks to Richard that I once had the privilege of having lunch with J.K. Galbraith at his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Thank you very much for that, Richard. He's going to talk this evening considering some of the work by Stephen Skowronek. How do you pronounce it?
Skowronek is fine.
Skowronek, about the thesis of presidential cycles in American politics and whether we are now facing the end of democracy in the United States. After Richard has spoken for about 35 minutes or so, I'm going to ask him a couple of questions and then we're going to throw it open to the floor. So Richard, if you'd like to...
Thank you very much, Misha.
You're welcome.
I'll stand here just because after teaching for 31 years, you go automatically to a lectern whenever you're in a room with a large number of seated people. So first of all, thank you very much, Rector, for inviting me, and it's a delight to have so many good friends, old friends here at the Institute for this talk this evening. What I want to do is make an argument. I want to make an argument about whether or not America is in fact facing an end to democracy. And I'll signal the punchline right away. I don't think it is. I think there are much more difficult problems that the United States is facing that are problems that Europe is facing as well, and in fact to different degrees and in different ways the world itself is facing, but it is not about, in the American case, the end of democracy. Why do I argue that? Well, this is partly the Skowronek argument that I'm going to elucidate in just a moment, but it extends from my own reading of American history, and that in fact American democracy has been under constant threat from the very beginning. It is not the question of there now being a threat. It is just one more era of threats that are reappearing as they do on an almost cyclical basis for reasons that I am more than happy to explain as far as I understand them. Now, let me try to situate why I've chosen to talk about Stephen Skowronek's work. Stephen is about my age. He teaches at Yale, and despite what you may think. There are those of us at Harvard who actually think men and women at Yale may have some ideas of consequence and value. And so we, in rare instances, are willing to look to New Haven for inspiration. And Stephen's work has been an inspiration for me, as it has been for many scholars in the field called presidential studies. And in particular, presidential studies that have been conducted in the last 30 years. Skowronek's first major work appeared in the early 90s. He's updated it and expanded it. And it's fair to say that within the American Political Science Association, it now represents a significant camp in terms of interpreting American political institutions and American political power. Now, what's so distinctive about Skowronek's argument? Well, Skowronek starts with something that should be self-evident, I think, for anyone who thinks about leaders who aspire to power, which is that of the roughly 4 men who have been president of the United States, virtually all of them have sought to be figures of consequence, people who were transformative in one way or another, who changed America in ways that represented their vision for America. And yet, if you ask historians, there are probably no more than half a dozen of those nearly 4 who can be called transformative figures. And Skowronek says, well, let's think about that for a minute. How is it that men so egotistically driven, so power-driven and ambitious could come to the stage of world history sitting in the White House and fail? And what he says is, you want to think for a moment about when you have seen these transformative figures, as he calls them, appear. And he says you have to understand that the presidency in the context of American politics is an institution of disruption, that in a way it's not an institution of governance, but of anti-governance, of constantly remaking, reshaping processes and patterns of governance. And it's from that remarkable cockpit in the White House that these transformers act. But he says, notice that they only appear at intervals. They don't come one after the other or near to one another, even within a decade. They all tend, in historical terms, to spread out. They tend to come in intervals of 25 to 50 years. Now, one way that I ask my students to think about this is to think about the fact that America has had a 2-party system, meaning the Democrat or the Republican has been the party that has nominated and elected all of the presidents since 1856. So not the entire history of the United States, but the great majority, and certainly the history of the 20th century, the history of the last nearly 200 years in America. Now, if you think about the period from Abraham Lincoln in 1860 up to Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, you have a period of nearly 75 years, a very long period. I asked my students, how many Democrats were elected president in that nearly 3/4 of a century? And they go, Well, the answer is just 2 in a 72-year period. Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson. Now think about the period from Roosevelt's election to Ronald Reagan's election in 1980, a 50-year period, basically. How many Republicans were elected to office in that period? 2, Eisenhower and Richard Nixon. If you go back and look at the period before Abraham Lincoln's election, at Andrew Jackson's election, from the 1830s to the 1860s, you have a 30-year period, one of the shorter periods. How many Whigs were elected in that period? 2. Now, Skowronek is not a numerologist, and neither am I, and I'm not trying to make the case that there is something magical about the number 2 that determines the number of opposition party presidents that will be elected in a certain period. Instead, what I want you to focus on is the idea that there are long cycles that seem to be born after each of these transformative figures appears that locks in a range of political options for both parties for a significant period of time. Now, the transformer may want to create an everlasting legacy, but of course this is a world full of human beings. And so none of these legacies last. They all have half-lives, and as a consequence, these cycles deteriorate, and ultimately a new transformer will appear. And a new transformer will then recalibrate the politics that come out of the White House and that set the agenda for the two-party political system for another long cycle. There will be struggles within that cycle, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But what I want you to see, and what Skowronek has made clear, I think, in very powerful ways, is that we need to recognize that there are ways in which these transformative figures lock into place two important features of politics that are determinative of these long periods. The first is that the president assembles a stable political coalition. There is no bloc in the American voting system that is majority bloc. It is a set of minority blocs of one kind or another, drawn by race, by region, by class, by gender, etc. And it's a constant struggle to assemble those into a majority coalition that can govern. One that can elect a president, one that can also additionally elect majorities to one or both houses of Congress. And so the work of American politics in a two-party federal system, non-parliamentary system, is always how do we assemble and how do we hold together that bloc that will give us party power to determine the politics of a long period. Now, the question always arises, well, then how does an opposition party figure appear? How does a Democrat get elected in a Republican cycle? How does a Republican get elected in a Democratic cycle? And Skowronek has an answer for that as well, too, which I find powerful, which is that the opposition party figure is able to challenge a successor to the transformer only because that opposition party figure recrafts his politics to fit within the broad outlines of the cycle that the transformer has determined. So let's think for a minute about the two presidents that are elected in the long Roosevelt cycle, and those are Dwight Eisenhower in the 50s and Richard Nixon in the late 60s and early 70s. Neither of those men could be nominated by today's Republican Party because the coalitions that represent the Republican Party are different from those that govern, that operated in the long transformative cycle of Franklin Roosevelt. Eisenhower said to his brother several different times on record, I'm not going to attack the unions. I'm not going to attack Social Security. None of the major social welfare gains that we associate with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal came under attack from the Republican Party while Eisenhower was in power. Now, there were elements of the Republican Party, and we can talk about McCarthyism and its particular purposes, and that's an important topic. But what I want to emphasize is this idea that the opposition party figures that appear are locked into a broad ideologically mapped frame that is determined by the prior transformer. Think about Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is a man who signed the most important environmental legislation of the last 50 years. Richard Nixon was in favor of a minimum guaranteed income for all citizens. Richard Nixon, in an interview, unasked, volunteered to a CBS reporter that he too was now a Keynesian. Can you imagine Ron DeSantis announcing that he too is now a Keynesian? Not any more likely than I'm going to Disneyland this weekend, as words that would come out of Ron DeSantis' mouth these days. So what you want to understand then is that Skowronek is trying to point you to something that's very important, that there are these cycles, what he calls the long presidential cycles in American political history, and that you need to try to understand what politics is doing relative to where you are in those cycles. And the argument that Skowronek or I would make now is that we're at the long end of the Reagan cycle, and that what's going to appear is likely to be a turn progressively toward a democratic long cycle, and there are a number of additional reasons why I think that's true, which I'll articulate in a moment, but that a lot of the disruption and the dislocation that we're feeling now that some consider to be about the end of democracy is in fact the rumble and the shake that goes on as an old cycle dies and a new one emerges. Okay, that's a very different perspective to take on the current political situation. We can call it a crisis, but politics is full of crises. That politics lives off of crisis. So the question is, what, in a longer-term view of politics, can we think about the current period? And Skowronek is offering us a way to do that. Now, a couple of other things that you want to think about when you think about presidents of the last 100 years or so. Following the transformer, you always get, these are my terms, not Skowronek's, the acolyte. The vice president who has loyally served under the president who is the transformer, whose calling card politically is, I'm just like the master. I'm the Rooseveltian. I'm the Reaganaut. The George H.W. Bush of read my lips, no new taxes, is all about being Ronald Reagan's acolyte. Just as Harry Truman's announcement that he was in favor of the fair deal is meant to say to American voters, oh no, you're getting a complete loyalist to the transformers' position and views. Now, in neither case is that true, because the world is moving on and new problems are arising. In Harry Truman's case, it was the emergence of the Cold War. In the case of George H.W. Bush, it was the end of the Cold War, each of which was a crisis of a sort, each presenting different challenges to American power. But it's significant that you find this sequencing that goes on that requires the first president after a transformer to act in a manner that is almost submissive or subservient to the doctrinal views, to the party alliances, to the worldview of the master transformer. And then you have the appearance of the opposition party president, because these cycles are unstable, and the further you get away from the master and the more disappointed part of your electorate is with the acolyte, the greater the opportunity for the opposition party figure to emerge. But as I pointed out earlier, what happens is they don't run on platforms that look all that different from the ones that have been set in place by the transformer. I won't re-summarize what I had to say about Eisenhower and Nixon, but think now about Bill Clinton and think about Barack Obama. Bill Clinton is neoliberalism incarnate. Bill Clinton's politics are about recasting what by the 1980s looked like the dead cycle of Rooseveltian democratic politics, and that fit within the new conservatism that Reagan has established, that Clinton and a consensus of elite leaders within the Democratic Party believe is the new possible direction for the Democrats. Tony Blair is not particularly different in the labor context, but I don't want to draw that analogy too closely. Barack Obama finds himself in a position not unlike that of Richard Nixon when faced with what looks like the worst financial crisis since the 1930s, determines on the advice of Larry Summers and Geithner and Bernanke that he'll rescue the banks and let the homeowners fend for themselves. No major American bank went under during the rescue operation executed by Barack Obama. 9 million Americans lost their homes. Now, if that were the Roosevelt era, Obama couldn't have been reelected. And in fact, Obama was punished for it by voters because it showed up in the losses that the Democratic Party then took in Congress in 2010, and then in state and local government, where in the 8 years that Obama was in office, the Democratic Party gave up over 1,000 elected offices at the federal, state, and major local level. So what you have here is this problem that we then have to face with, well, what do we now make of Donald Trump and his legacy? Well, one thing to think about might be to think about Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter comes to office claiming that essentially Washington is a swamp, and his moral rectitude is going to be the source of the draining of that particular swamp. And he is a businessman untainted by politics or the corruption of Washington itself, and is instead a gifted administrator and innovator demonstrated by his millionaire peanut farmer status that will make him an ideal president. Well, one could go back even earlier than Jimmy Carter and recognize that that was Herbert Hoover's agenda in 1928. The core story that Hoover had to tell at the end of a long Republican cycle was, I'm an engineer. I'm efficiency incarnate. I'm not ideological. I'm not partisan. And what happens is the party coalition falls apart. When you see these figures start to appear who are running away from politics itself, I can almost with absolute certainty tell you that you are in a period where a long cycle is ending. Now, what should we think about all of that? Does that then mean that that somehow that Joe Biden is the beginning of a long Biden era? Joe is older than I am, and so the possibility of a long era for Joe himself is limited, right? Limited. At the same time, it may well be that what Biden is doing is playing a role of John the Baptist, if you will, while the Democrats seek a figure that can play the role that would inaugurate the new transformative era. But the important thing to watch about Biden is how his politics have been executed as policy in the last 2 years. If you had said to me during the primaries that Joe Biden would implement programs endorsed by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, I would have said, oh, please, you don't understand American politics. Joe is a total insider. He's been in Washington since he was 29 years old. He only knows about Washington politics and power from the inside. And yet what I want to argue is that what you're seeing is the recalibration by Joe Biden based on his reading of the electoral basis shift that represents one of these transformative moments. What's happening here is that underneath this transformative figure search that's going on, we have a deeper shift going on in American politics. And it's being driven in no small part by what I tell my students is the fourth great wave of migration to the United States. You have to understand, the Western Hemisphere was the last part of the world, the habitable world, settled by human beings. Human beings didn't enter the North American territory that is now the United States until roughly 15 to 20,000 years ago. That means that they had left Africa probably 120 to 150,000 years earlier. And what happened was that migration across the Bering Land Bridge that connected Siberia and Alaska, where Sarah Palin was able to watch on a daily basis for incoming Soviet planes, brought the first of these great migrations to what becomes the United States. The second is a European-African migration that begins in the 17th century, in the early 1600s. We talk about it as a European migration, but it wasn't really. If you look at the data from the very first census of the United States in 1790, the overwhelming majority of Europeans, as in between 75 and 80% of the European origined citizens of the United States came from the British Isles. And the other population, which goes counted but unrecognized, is a massive population of forced migration from West Africa and also from the Caribbean of African slaves. Those are the two component parts of the second migration. In the 19th century, you get a third migration, and it is a continental European migration, And it's Ireland and Germany and Italy and Poland and Russia feeding in this enormous wave of new immigrants that form the basis for the transformative politics of the progressive era and are going to lay the ground for the Roosevelt coalition of the 1930s. Because they're coming in as outsiders and living at the margins, trying to work their way in. We now have today 1 in 4 Americans, as part of this fourth migration that we're living through, who are either foreign-born or the sons or daughters of someone who was foreign-born. 1 out of 4. That's as high. In fact, it's, by some estimates, a little bit higher than it was in 1910, which was the peak of the previous great 19th century migration. So we have a profound reshaping of the demography of the United States going on, and I assure you that that is contributing to this realignment that is taking shape and that Joe Biden can see. Now, the other thing that Biden can see is that the percentage of young people as percentage of voters and the percentage of young college-educated people as a percentage of voters is going up constantly. At the beginning of the Roosevelt era in the 1930s, no more than about 4 or 5% of Americans had college degrees. Now it's closer to 40%. And with those college degrees has come something very significant. Up until the 1960s, college graduates voted Republican. Since the 1960s, college graduates have voted consistently Democratic, and we're manufacturing more of them and more of them and more of them every year. And as they take on millennial, as they're called millennial identities, they're coming with a politics that is driving what critics call this woke revolution, but which is a signifier of a generational consciousness that wants change that is of a kind that the Republican Party cannot, at this present moment, offer. The Republican Party is now trapped. It has taken over the white South from the Democratic Party, where the white South used to reside. And the white population of America is getting smaller year by year. They have bet on the slow horse. And so there are many more things I'd like to say, but I want to wind it up because I'm sure that I'm over time. What I've tried to emphasize here is that it's important to think about the challenges that American democracy is facing in a long context, not in the context of what CNN is telling you is most important. Almost certainly it won't be. What I want you to do is use a framework like Skowronek's to think about why you can recognize for heuristic purposes cycles in American political history that signify that in telling a story about how few transformers there have been among so many presidents tells a story about how long political science cycles operate and when they come into a moment of change. I believe not that we are at the end of democracy, but that we are at the beginning of another long challenge, but that it is one that is potentially and is likely to be governed by a democratic coalition that leans left for at least the next 20 to 25 years. Thank you. Okay.
Richard, fantastic. I've got a number of questions emerging from that. First of all, when we've spoken about this before, you've talked about the transformer presidents creating a new narrative. Mm-hmm. What are the forces that go to offering the fuel for that narrative, and is the transformative nature of the president his ability, because of course, as you pointed out, we're only talking about men, his ability to make that narrative convincing?
That's a great question, thank you. I think that the forces that I think about, if you want to think about deep structural forces, are demographic, economic, in the sense of both income for households or individuals, and also economic opportunity in terms of the shape of the economy. And then finally, what I'd call cultural ideological, which is about the moral choices combined with political choices that are the work of both citizens and of political leaders. I've pointed to the demographic change that I want to emphasize in terms of immigration and the importance of immigration to American history. I could talk at equally great length about internal migration, because internally, America has one of the highest mobility rates of any country of record. Something like 15% of Americans move every year. It's not the same 15%. I was always reminded of a woman giving a lecture on birth control and saying that somewhere on the planet, a woman was giving birth every 7 seconds, and someone in the audience saying, well, can't we just ask her to stop? So I want to be clear about what I'm saying, right? The cultural is, I'll skip over the economic for a moment. The cultural is this question of who we are and where we treasure relationships and what it is that we seek for our world. All of us grow up in ways that offer opportunity for moral imagination. And that moral imagination finds its expression in no small way in the political systems that we build. One of the things that always leaves me uncomfortable about Europe is the number of castles still standing, and the idealized memory of a monarchic, pre-democratic world. I simply don't have the moral capacity to register affirmation, even as entertainment, of the values of monarchy. You don't even want to talk to me about the coronation in England a few weeks ago. Don't go anywhere near me on that subject. I would like to put that era of human history behind me as much as I would like to forever see slavery as an era in human history put behind me. Both are forms of mental as well, mental imprisonment, even if slavery was forcibly a physical form of enslavement. We should not live our lives assuming that there are betters who deserve more because of birthright or privilege of some sort that is inherited. We need now, more than ever, in a world that's waking up to the affluence of Europe and North America, to recognize that in the process of creating greater affluence in the world of those 6 or 7 billion who don't live among us, that if we don't also inspire some sense of democratic moral imagination in them, the failure will redound to us in quite bleak ways. There is a duty, in some sense, to be able to speak about those cultural values and to engage those cultural values. So I think that when I see my students acutely alarmed by issues of inequality, I'm reminded that in the 1960s, I too was alarmed by conditions of inequality, but had settled at some point in my life, for whatever reasons, for the idea of aspiring to greater equality. And that we now have among us a younger generation who's saying, no, enough, no more with this aspiring to equality around gender or sexual identity, or just stop it, no, over. My son was about to send, my son is engaged, was about to send out a letter in which he spoke of his fiancée, and he spelled it F-I-A-N-C-E, and being just
the pedant
that I am, I said, no, Sam, when it's a woman, it's F-I-A-N-C-E-E. And it was like, how dumb are you, Dad? Do you think that I'm going to genderize a term like that? And he was like, okay, I get it. We're over and done with, moving on. And while it makes me uncomfortable because it blocks my opportunities for pedantry, it, on the other hand, thrills me to see them taking the idea of greater equality seriously, even if I don't think that's where the most attention should be paid. The willingness to try to seek out oneself in the lived imagination of others is the greatest opportunity that we have as human beings to live on the planet with one another. And to the degree that we let ourselves be mesmerized by royalty or war or consumption, we give up on the possibility of being human in the fullest sense. So I think those cultural things are also very important.
You mentioned about in the 60s that you became comfortable with aspiring to equality, but the point about the last presidential cycle from Reagan till now is that the United States has experienced the most dramatic rise in inequality. I mean, absolutely jaw-dropping. So
now, we're here at the home of Austrian economics, so I just want to be careful about the locals.
Exactly, promoted, of course, by Austrian economics.
There we go.
So there are two things. It's no surprise, surely, that your sons and daughters are no longer prepared to put up with this, that finally the depth of this inequality has been recognized. And does that mean that Trump, as your Jimmy Carter figure, the last brave attempt to keep the cycle alive, is actually a drowning figure, that he's never going to be able to convince the current demographic that he is an authentic representative of cleaning the swamp or whatever it is he's trying to sell them? When Trump came along, did you think, right, that's it, we're going to see something very, very different in the years to come?
Three things. First, I'm an economist, so I think stochastically. And so I wouldn't apply Skowronek's concepts to individual elections with a kind of predetermined conviction that because we've entered that nothing could happen that would allow Trump to gain office. Many things could happen. Joe Biden could have a heart attack tomorrow and be gone. Kamala Harris could succeed to office and not be able to mobilize parts of the constituency that Biden is assembling right now. Or Biden could choose not to run. I don't think that's going to be the case. And then there's a convention fight or there's a primary fight in the candidate. So in terms of the individual circumstance, I just don't know. Markets could break in very strange ways. The Putin war could begin to break in very dangerous ways. There are a number of factors that in terms of individual elections, the Skowronek model isn't designed to answer. It's meant to sort of look at long arcs. I think the other is that it's really vitally important to think about what it means in John Dewey's terms to be a democratic citizen and keep that at the front of the conversation as much as possible. I think that one of the things that disappointed me about my years of teaching at Harvard was that we always segregated the teaching of economics from the teaching of politics and political science. And it's a kind of intellectual apartheid that has done great damage, I think, to both fields. And I could talk at great length about that in some other context. But I think that just as we have long periods with distinguished transformative presidents, it's also the case that we have transformative economists that get attached to each of these long cycles. So think for a moment, which is Alfred Marshall attached to the long Republican cycle from the mid-19th century up until Roosevelt. Keynes attached to the Roosevelt cycle that runs all the way to Richard Nixon's declaration of being a Keynesian. And then the arrival of Friedman and of Arthur Laffer from Chicago as the distinctive transformative economists of the Reagan cycle. I think in some ways you want to pay attention to Thomas Piketty, or Piketty, as the figure who may emerge in this next period. Why? Because think of Marshall as focused on production and the resolution of problems of pricing in a world in which the rapid explosion of production leads to questions that need to be solved. Think of Keynes as one of focus on an aggregate growth that is about restoring demand in a capitalist world that cannot produce adequate demand to match its capacities for production. But think about Piketty as someone who's addressing head-on the question of distribution of the capacity to work and consume in a world in which the issue is no longer about the scarcity of goods, but the availability of those goods to a broad population. The extraordinary capacity of capitalism to produce is represented in the rate at which China has become the power that it is. That's not just a society, that's a technology and a system of organization and production that is phenomenal, and one has to give elements of capitalism credit for that. But capitalism is very bad without strong hands in control of decisions about distribution, in distributing the ability to consume those products, or setting priorities on levels of consumption and production both, which are the great issue for the environment in the coming generations. So I think that what we want to be looking for is a way to capture imaginatively a new way of being engaged with one another that reaffirms not just the politics of the moment, but that speaks to a richer sense of what it means to be in a democratic culture, and a democratic culture that's more radically egalitarian in many ways around many different poles or axes.
But then you could, I mean, the interesting thing you mentioned about Biden at the beginning, adopting policies associated with Bernie and Elizabeth, Elizabeth Warren, is, I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act is the one that we're most familiar with here in Europe, because it was seen as protectionist, it was seen as a threat to European interests initially, although there's been quite a lot of discussion across the Atlantic since then, and the Europeans are feeling more accommodating towards it at the moment. But this is a remarkable turn, it seems to me, the Inflation Reduction Act, and that were Biden to continue along this path into a second administration, is it conceivable that Sleepy Joe actually emerges as a transformative president?
It's very, very possible. It's very, very possible. I mean, again, Skowronek's theory isn't a method for precisely recognizing the individual in advance or the moment in which the new period starts. Those are the privilege of historians who can look back and say, it was that election, that 2020 election that marked the turn. We don't know that yet. It could be the 24 election. It could be the 28 election. We don't know yet. But what I think you want to think about is that America under Biden is, let me say this a little differently. And so Biden is very clearly, in terms of industrial policies, for want of a better word, and social welfare, picking up on Warren and Sanders, because there are huge Warren-Sanders voting blocks within the party that he needs to weld. He is also a president who sits atop a federal budget that contains over $1 trillion a year for the military. And Congress cannot stop giving the military more money than it wants or can possibly spend every year. And what you have in that is also a logic about the United States as the global hegemon that has not been successfully reconceived politically, let alone economically. The United States can do things like pass the Inflation Adjustment Act and essentially ignore Europe's complaints, or feign a sense of, oh, you're right, well, that's very good. Just the same way they sold submarines to the Australians to the great consternation of our good friend, Monsieur Macron. The United States is going to do what the United States does because it wants to do, because it's the United States, and it has that power still. What I think it's trying to do on a geopolitical basis, which is quite apart from the Sanders Warren domestic scene, is reassert something that looks like a Western bloc dominated by the United States. Europe is in no ways in the vulnerable position it was in the 1940s and early 1950s, but Europe is not Europe, right? I still think that, you know, you have federation problems that are not inconsequential. You know, when Kissinger was asked, you know, whom shall I call? What's the area code for Europe? It isn't Brussels, it isn't Belgium still. So that there's deep structural political work that needs to get done in Europe, but that part of this new Biden era, don't be mistaken, isn't just to satisfy social democrats and leftists and progressives. There is also an enormous amount of spending and strategic thinking going on that is meant to contain his right as well too. So, and that can have its own consequences for Europe.
Thanks, Richard. So I'm going to throw it open to the floor now. I think we need a microphone because of the...
Thank you for your excellent insights. One of the things you didn't mention is the fundamental problems in the U.S. Constitution. Electoral college. Second, the Senate, disproportionate power of the Senate. Third is even the House, where you have gerrymandering among states, that where you get the popular vote should be the Democrats, but it's Republicans. Could you comment why that's not nothing to mention in this insightful lecture?
Oh, well, thank you for your kind words. Taking on the structural defects of the Constitution is, I'm almost 76, and I just don't want to climb that particular hill any longer. I've been up those mountains before, and there are some imaginative things that are out there. One is model legislation that would bind states to support the candidate who is elected within their state. And I want to get this right. It's a process of using state legislatures under state-passed laws to bind them so that you couldn't have electors go default from whatever it was that had been. And this doesn't require a constitutional amendment. The gerrymandering isn't something you can fix in at the House level with a constitutional amendment. It's about state legislatures and the control that state legislatures and courts have over districting. The Senate problem is the Senate problem. How it is that Wyoming with 600,000 people has the same number of senators as California with 45 million. It's a real problem. But it is not such a problem that work can't get done, and it is the framework that we have. So I would rather focus on mobilization of voters and envisioning the possibilities of a more progressive cycle that has strength and vision both domestically and internationally than trying to climb back up on that old machine called the Constitution and seeing if I can wrench that particular amendment out of place or install a new one. Does that? It is what it is. If I were young like you, I would take it on, but I'm gonna step back.
So to reiterate the earlier comment, thank you for a really provocative, interesting talk.
Thank you.
I wanted to move to the immediate threats against the mobilization of voters that you were just mentioning.
Yep.
And certainly threats to the electorate or efforts to restrict or constrain that electorate are nothing new. But thinking in particular, for example, not just about gerrymandering, but about, for example, Texas's current efforts to constrain the relative electoral power of Harris County, where Houston is located, this sort of thing. Right. I was wondering if you could perhaps bring, if this is something that you've looked at, a historical perspective on these efforts to constrain the voters whose mobilization seems to be a central linchpin of these transformative swings that you're discussing?
Well, I mean, again, you sort of, the Jacksonian cycle starts in no small part because there's an expansion of the franchise. That in the first 30 years of the American Republic, the right to vote was confined not just to white males, but white males with property. And that property requirement was the one that essentially disappears in the run-up to the Jacksonian election, and many historians argue, is how that Jackson cycle comes into being, because you've got a new constituency that hadn't been able to vote, and Jackson was more successful than his opponents in assembling that coalition. The problems today, I think, are large, and I think that they're real, but on balance, I think they can be overcome by turnout efforts. I mean, what you've seen, a colleague of mine, whom I admire very much, wrote a book called The Vanishing Voter on the decline of voting in the United States, and he published the book in the year 2000. Well, since 2004, every cycle, voter participation has gone up. We're in a period that is unprecedented in terms of voter participation levels in the last 100 years. And I think that what you want to think about is, yes, there are Republican legislatures in key states putting impediments in place to potential Democratic voters, and yet potential Democratic voters are showing up in record numbers to overcome those impediments. I mean, Georgia was a classic example of, you know, we were going to lose because the Republicans were writing such restrictive registration and voting laws, and guess what? We've got 2 Democratic senators in Georgia, and we had record African-American turnout that wasn't constrained, that overwhelmed the barriers that the Republicans had put in place. So I think that there is still room. Remember, we're talking not about all 50 states, and there are 20 to 25 states, 20 states that are just not competitive at all, so you just set them aside. You're really concerned about half a dozen states right now. And in those states, there are problems like Wisconsin, but there are others like Pennsylvania where there are reasons to be pretty optimistic that we can mobilize at levels that will overcome the structural impediments that have been put in place. Am I answering the, okay, thank you.
I just want a little follow-up on that, Richard, talking about the contemporary situation. To what extent is the Supreme Court's decision on Roe versus Wade looking like it's backfiring on the Republicans at the moment?
I would have asked that same question about the Dred Scott decision in 1858. I think that the Roe decision is the greatest gift the Supreme Court could have given the Democratic Party. I think that we have plenty of evidence that it turned out additional voters and that it swung, in particular, suburban women who had been voting Republican over to the Democratic Party. And I think sometimes that this is the role of the Supreme Court, to be so egregiously wrong on the merits of an argument that it actually creates the conditions that lead to the world that it is trying to hold off. So,
Randall, I saw you with your hand up there. Sorry.
Thanks. I'll stand as well. I just want to see if I understand your argument and come to Misha's question and put it slightly more formally in terms of mechanisms. Oh. You talked about the economic crisis, the Great Migration, and the college educated. An economic crisis makes perfect sense in the 30s, and indeed, I'm very interested in 1973, the oil crisis, the inflation, how that gave the Republicans the excuse to pin the crisis on labor and to transform into what became Reaganomics. That makes perfect sense. Ditto college education, these extraordinary attitudes to gender, race, sexuality, 25% of my son's generation calling themselves LGBTQ+.
And in my generation, it would have been 2 to 5%.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
Right.
So huge transformation, college education. The piece I didn't quite understand was the Great Migration and the role it played. Is it simply that, which seems to be true, migrants tend to vote for the Democratic Party, even when on some of those family values they're actually leaning a little bit Republican? Question one. And then question two, do you see any danger to your story, which I very much hope is true, with the drift of some Latinos to Trump and the Republicans, and the drift of some black male voters to Trump and the Republicans? Or is that just Republican wishful thinking?
Those are excellent questions. I think what I'd emphasize is that we have a history of immigrant democratic voting behavior that is so clear from the what I call the third cycle that begins in the 1830s and goes till 1910, and that we have enough initial information about its impact this cycle that begins really in the 1970s and 1980s, that we have to conclude on balance that this is a constituency that will lean Democratic for at least 2 generations. We've got plenty of evidence that, you know, Irish Catholics who were, I mean, to be Irish Catholic in America for 100 years meant that you were Democratic, right? That's no longer the case. As people become more affluent, they become more secure, they have a stake, more and more of them have become Republican. Catholics as a group that used to vote, well, JFK, for example, won election in 1960 because 82% of Catholics voted Democratic. You're lucky to get 45% of Catholics to vote Democratic, but when you look at those numbers, what's happening is there's a big block break between what I call Euro-Catholics and Hispanic Catholics. Catholics who come, whose parents or ancestors come from European countries, and those who come from or whose ancestors come from South or Central America. Why do immigrants tend to vote in certain ways? I think that they experience discrimination, and they experience economic hardship, and they experience a constraint of opportunity in many cases in the society, and they hear one of the parties being more welcoming to the critique that justifies that kind of treatment. And that the historic model of the Democrats' success in the great cities of America in the midst of the 19th century was that they delivered services, they delivered jobs, they delivered apartments, they delivered opportunity to people. And I think so much of what Biden's doing with promises of student debt relief and expansion of the social welfare net is meant to signal exactly that. That for recent immigrants who are much more likely to be vulnerable to unemployment, that first of all, the unemployment benefits are going to be strengthened and extended. Second, that we're going to provide for more educational opportunity to acquire skills that will give you more opportunity for job security and also upward mobility. Third, that we're going to provide ways to help you acquire housing in ways that are not subject to the kinds of discriminatory lending that has been historic about American so-called redlining. So those are, I think, all the factors. And, you know, so far I think that the message that's coming out of the Latino vote, the African-American male vote is so dodgy in terms of the accuracy of polling that I'm willing not to believe it, that what you've got is a margin of error in those poll numbers given the resistance to pollsters that we've got nowadays. And the Latinos, I grew up in Southern California, and for someone to be surprised that there's a culturally conservative Spanish-speaking community coming from Mexico or Central America means you don't understand. You're not willing to learn. But that was also true of Italians coming to America in the 1880s. It was true of Germans coming and Poles coming. It's not like immigrants all come because, you know, Marx and Lenin told them, go west, young man. That's not the story. But again, I always think stochastically, and so I'm always attentive to what's the lean, where it's leaning. And so I think that this fourth great wave of migration is one of the big underpinnings that will justify talking about this as an emerging transformative era. That's how I do it.
One, two.
Thank you. You mentioned the $1 trillion U.S. budget for defense. And I wonder to what extent the U.S. can continue to have such large budget deficits, and in particular, if the U.S. can continue to afford to be a world leader, particularly given that Americans don't like paying taxes. If the U.S. can't continue to be a world leader, is there a graceful way for the U.S. to relinquish or decrease its position as a world leader?
Well, there are several questions wrapped up in that one question, so that's great. Let me see if I can sort out the questions that I saw in there. The United States can sustain budget deficits and accumulating federal debt for quite some time. It doesn't seem to be the case that people are fleeing the dollar in global markets. And there is also a kind of automatic feeding loop that goes on in global capital markets today that are being fed by pension funds and by sovereign wealth funds that have risk portfolios that require the acquisition of substantial amount of highly liquid assets. So I think that looking at sort of the shape of the world, I'm not lying awake at night thinking that the euro or the Chinese yuan is about to replace the dollar as the dominant currency, and therefore that the United States is going to have difficulty in borrowing the money it needs to finance. The second is that, you know, a modestly healthy level of inflation is always good for debt reduction. And I think sometimes that political commentators forget that oftentimes some of the best efforts at debt reduction have come inadvertently through bursts of inflation. I would imagine that unlike the current Fed chairman, I'm not that keen about a 1 to 2% inflation rate. I could live with a 4% inflation rate if I thought that it was helping us manage debt levels. So there's that as one set of questions. I think there's a separate question about what it means to be a hegemon, what it means to be a leader. And I think that had Franklin Roosevelt survived and lived through his fourth term, America would have emerged as a different kind of hegemon, and that the conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States that was in some sense inevitable might not have lasted as long or have become as dangerous or, more important, as expensive as this formation has become. And the question of a different kind of hegemonic leadership hinges a great deal on what Europe is willing to become. Because for the foreseeable future, the largest single partner in sharing responsibility in that hegemonic role rests in Europe. And that's not something that I, as an American, can resolve for you as Europeans. That's a debate that has to go on among you. But as I say, I think that the geostrategic decision that's been reached in the U.S. national security state is that we intend to rebind Europe more closely to us, rebind the Japanese more closely to us, bring Australia much more closely into us, invite the Indians closer. And we can talk about whether it would have been more advantageous to woo the Russians toward us rather than drive them toward the Chinese, but that story, that ship has sailed. That story is not to be told. So, you know, I think that the undone work of cultivating values of equality and liberty are the most important long-term work that we have as human beings to do on the planet, in addition to not destroying the planet. It's going to be kind of moot if we resolve our values issues and we've destroyed the planet in the meantime. And I think that balancing issues of equality with issues of compressed consumption and limiting the danger to the planet and other species as well as ourselves, is the mix that we have not yet fully articulated politically or intellectually. We're still free riding too much on the Enlightenment liberal values that were the work of earlier generations, and have not stepped forward in such a way that we have coherently brought together the threads that are clearly in front of us right now, but that have not been woven into a single narrative that actually has global reach.
Thank you. Two quick questions. One about running. Why do Democrats have such a tough time running big cities? I just spent 13 years in San Francisco and really saw it firsthand with my children and work and everything else. And same when I lived in New York City, and same as I traveled to Seattle and others, and Chicago. Why can't it be like Vienna? Like 4 months in Vienna that I've been here, it's just a very completely different quality of life. Number one. Number two, in your friend, my former colleague from Yale.
Many Google employees in San Francisco.
Yeah, we call them Googleites. They've left.
There we go.
They left now. Now there's nobody, so that's a different problem. But it is something structural. It is something structural that should be looked at. If you're, from your lips to God's ears about this long reign of the Democrats, let's see it. But then also, let's also look at the Democrats and see how they fix this. The second question is, my former Yale colleague that you keep referencing maybe missed one factor, which is the geopolitical. Even major longer-term waves.
Skowronek doesn't spend a lot of time on the geopolitical.
But does the American electorate? Does the American electorate spend time? Do you think that influence of First and Second World War and Korea and rise of Russia had some impact on the prior presidential elections? And do you think they'll have an outsized impact now if China does something silly in Taiwan or Putin does something crazy? How would you account for those foreign policy issues?
Well, so first on the cities, American cities are tough to govern for a number of reasons, and no small part of it is the economic inequality that is so prevalent in the United States. There are also deep racial and ethnic divides that are still very acidically corrosive, and that take generations to heal. It is also the case that so much of American housing in big cities has become a cost challenge for American families, such that you're seeing a lot of out-migration. Again, it's not as big as the 50s rush to the suburbs, but it is still the idea that there was flight into the cities, which was very popular in the 80s and 90s, seems to be reversing out again as people look for places other than big cities, and also big eastern cities, which or the big coastal cities. I think also that there is among the Democrats an unwillingness to deal with issues that would adversely affect their political coalitions. People who have been denied equality for generations contain within them people who can be seemingly reckless or destructive in terms of their behavior. And we also have a culture that celebrates pleasure to such an extent that that pleasure easily slips over into self-destruction. And we haven't found a particularly good balance in our culture, because particularly the commodification of pleasure and the commodification of entertainment means that there's too much money attached to pleasure for pleasure's own good. On the geopolitical, I think that there are a substantial number of Americans that could be mobilized by a better description of the role that the United States could play in the world. I am part of that generation of the 1950s. my mother once said of my father that he thought that my father was a Protestant minister, a Protestant clergyman, and my mother once said of my father that he thought that the Holy Trinity was Father, Son, and Franklin Roosevelt. And so I come from a particular upbringing that is about progressive Protestant social gospel, social justice values. And I still think that that narrative has real purchase, but I don't think that it's been well articulated in the last half century. I think one of the last great voices able to articulate it was Martin Luther King, and he was assassinated. JFK, for my generation, was starting to do that work all over again for my generation, and he was assassinated. And I can't point to inspiring figures around that story within the Reagan cycle. I think that the almost magical appeal of Barack Obama was that he seemed to contain some of that in him, and I still think that he contains some of that dream, but didn't have the administrative capacity, if that's how to describe it, to execute the dream. But to watch my students react to Barack Obama's election and the sense of hope that it raised in them made me realize that that latency, that hope exists latently in all of us and has to be reawakened, and that the most important function of great leaders is to reawaken hope.
Given our current situation where we're moving into, I mean, you referred to the other cycles as coinciding with and being influenced by shifting tectonic plates of geopolitics. Those tectonic plates are shifting at the moment, you know, and we can all feel it. And so will the China issue, because US-China relations will be the dominant and decisive international factor in the next 30 years or so, is that going to impact on US electoral politics, do you think?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it has to. I guess I'd say one thing, though, is that when I emphasize that Biden is executing a turn on the geopolitical level that's meant to pull back together some of the old coalitions of 50 years ago, that given the enormity of the world and the increasing sophistication of governments outside the North Atlantic, the ability of that North Atlantic American-led, if you will, hegemonic rule is not going to be as easy to execute. That I look at the Middle East and go, this is going to be very, very complicated over the next 40 years. I look at an emerging Africa and go, this is not a question of just settling up colonial or ex-colonial scores. This is there's a real developmental challenge here about the distribution of power, not just of wealth or of income. And that part of my argument for a recalibrated hegemonic role is to see a loosening of the kinds of militant controls and militarized controls that were so characteristic of the Cold War.
Anyone else? Well, then it falls to me to give you a very big thank you, Richard Parker, for an absolutely fascinating talk.
Thank you.
Very illuminating.
Thank you.
And I think wine and cheese is the only other appropriate response. So
Thank you
please
so very much.
Follow us downstairs for some wine and cheese. Thank you very much indeed.